how about we also look at the darker side of translingual speakers? How about there's a huge dark side in translingual studies. It's not all about celebrating, for example, linguistic creativity or hybridity. So I'm a senior lecturer at Curtin University, Western Australia, and previously I was a associate professor at the University of Japan. So I'm a social linguist, and I'm also an applied linguist, and my research background, research expertise is on language and society and culture. I study the cultural and linguistic norms and expectations and contexts in relation to language. I also study about the relationship between structure and agency and individuals and social groups in terms of language, society and culture. I work with young people who are located politically, financially, linguistically, culturally, geographically in peripheral contexts. Learning about young people's language and culture means we are learning about our future generation. That's why I think myself as a very privileged researcher, for example. And also, one of the most important facts that I work with young people is they are the main forces of today's globalization. So they are very active participants of a new social media, new technology, media and technology. They are very active players in the popular culture resources. They are actively involved with the cyber culture, cyber world. And then they are also very active in terms of their language, for example, in terms of their linguistic behaviors, cultural behaviors. So all these combinations, they make the research subject, young people, very interesting sort of, research context. I think it's very important to study about the language and other forms of communication because language and communication is basically one of the best assets we have as human beings. And I'm undertaking a very exciting brand new research project called The Politics of Injustice in Translingualism. So the research is about also about advancing these new theories in social linguistics. So in my previous research, I talked a lot about translingualism, how young people are involved in translanguaging and languaging and translingualism and so on. So I'm not going to leave that behind. I'm actually going to move forward with these theories. First, I want to explain a little bit about translingualism, for example. So it's quite different from these conventional theories of bilingualism, multilingualism, and code switching. For me, from my understanding. So, for example, bilingual and multilingual speakers are expected to speak the certain languages fluently. For example, okay, so if you speak English, if you speak French, or if you speak Chinese or Mongolian, you're multilingual, but you're expected to speak those languages fluently. So when you switch between the languages, for example, say between English and French, then you're expected to speak fluent English and fluent French, and that's what code switching is all about. But when you look at my research participants, for example, young people living in this current globalized world, it's a completely different story. They are actually, not many of my research participants are, for example, bilingual or multilingual speakers. So, for example, when they start, for example, doing the linguistic mixing practices, they're not necessarily speaking fluent English. They're not necessarily speaking, for example, fluent French, or they're not necessarily speaking fluent Japanese, for example. What they are doing is like sort of, they're using all these available linguistic and cultural and semiotic resources and repertoires and codes and styles to achieve their communicative practices. So they're sort of like translanguaging in between codes and repertoires and styles and voices It's not really they're switching between languages, they're switching between all these resources, for example. So when you look at all these studies, it's all very exciting. So it's all about linguistic creativity, linguistic productivity, it's about linguistic playfulness, right? It's about also linguistic hybridity. So there's sort of this tendency to celebrate translingualism. You know, everybody's quite excited and opportunistic and optimistic about this trend. So I was thinking lately, so how can I move forward, translingualism? How can we proceed, the discussion? Because are we gonna, celebrate it over and over and over? Okay, so new languages coming. So what are we going to do about it? When I started preparing my research proposal for the Australian Research Council, I sort of started thinking about my research participants. So when I was talking to them, when I was interviewing them, most of them had their own stories to tell me. For example, when I was speaking like that, when I was speaking sort of like broken English, or when I was speaking English with different accent, when I was using my heritage language mixed with English, I was told off by other English speakers to speak proper English. I was told off by other people, shop assistants, for example, bus drivers, to speak proper English, for example. And they face everyday discrimination, they face everyday injustice, they face everyday racism, not only in non-institutional settings like, for example, bus or shop, but also in institutional settings. They tell me many stories about that. And I was thinking, how can I sort of like, integrate these data in my research? Especially in Australian context, the standard sort of Australian English is highly preferred in an Australian context. So, for example, we had this sort of like a news headline. So this young indigenous, indigenous prison inmate in Northern Territory, they were sort of like hooded, and they were beaten by the prison guards, and it made a big headline by ABC Four Corners. So later, one of the inmates, young inmates, he gave his sort of like statement at the Royal Commission, and he said, I was beaten by the prison guards because I wasn't speaking proper English, so they would beat me for that. So these are all young people we're talking about, and these are all young people we're talking about with different backgrounds, like immigrant backgrounds, linguistically and culturally different background young people, indigenous young people, right? So when you talk to all these young people, they always tell me some, sad stories, how they got discriminated based solely on how they speak language, how they speak English, how they do the linguistic mixing. It's not accepted in the society, for example. So my current research project is actually to expand the knowledge in translingual studies and translingual research by filling this research gap. How about we also look at the darker side of translingual speakers? How about there's a huge dark side in translingual studies? It's not all about celebrating, for example, linguistic creativity or hybridity. We need to look at our research participants, listen to their stories carefully, and we need to look at the brighter side, optimistic and pessimistic or dark side of the translingual speakers, and we need to show it, to the world, what is really happening in social linguistic realities of young people. Looking at their online and offline lives, the Facebook language, for example, and these very sophisticated dynamics between online and offline. That's what makes the language very rich. So these young people are, I say this, they are the driving forces of the current globalization social-linguistically, because they are forming new forms of communication. They are forming like new forms of meanings and expressions which have never seen, for example, before. And it is exciting for us, and we are very excited to analyze that data, and we want to explore young people's world and philosophies and desires through that data. So I think that all these new forms of communication and new forms of language and meanings are also part of young people's identity. They are performing their own identities through their social linguistic practice, through their everyday ordinary lives and linguistic behaviors. So looking at all this social linguistic practice of young people is great. It's exciting, but what's the bigger picture, as you asked, right? So for me, the bigger picture should be very simple. For me, understanding young people's identities, their desires and their philosophies and their aspirations is very important for us as researchers, as educators, because we can make some recommendations and implications and conclusions based on what we have learned about our young people, and then we can recommend it to, for example, policymakers and decision makers, and we can raise awareness among the public, how the elder generation, how young people are seeing the today's world. The generation gap between old culture and youth culture, elder culture, elder generation and younger generation. So when, for example, hip-hop artists start mixing language, they get really this harsh criticism by the elder generation, for example, the traditionalists, the purists, right? Young people they get told off by the old people for, overlooking and ignoring the Mongolian language and Mongolian identity. And so I think this is sort of like the conflict between, youth culture and, the older generation. And there's this word like mesajti. So mesajti is a Mongolian word. Okay, so it is the combination between the word message, English message, message, and then it's sort of like Mongolian suffix d. Mongolian suffix d is like let's do that in English. So the combination between message and d is like let's message, right? So this is sort of like very anglicized Mongolian, right? But are they really code switching here? Are they really, multilingual speakers here? I don't think so, because message is sort of like, it's like now Facebook or mobile phone, sort of like default language. Everybody knows message now across the globes, right? So saying it as English word is very sort of like problematic right now. So they're sort of using this technology, they're sort of integrating this technology word into the Mongolian language, into the Mongolian syntax, for example, and they're using it as an ordinary, word. Like they relocalized message into Mongolian suffix d, and then they're using as Mongolian language, for example, message d. That means let's message, right? So I think these kind of examples are actually, in fact, very common across the globe. It's not that very surprising, or it's not very unconventional. But if you look at very local sort of context, of course it's interesting, because language is sort of expanding. Language is changing based on the globalization, based on media, technology, the linguistic features of the Facebook, for example, right? For example, the word tagli. So zorga tagli. Tagli means let's tag this picture. So tag, the word tag is sort of like Facebook default word tag, and then it's mixed with the Mongolian, suffix li. So that means, let's tag the picture on Facebook. So sort of, there's thousands of examples like that.